Many of you probably have never heard of one Julian Castro. Julian Castro is the former mayor of San Antonio. He is an Obama alum. He was working in the housing and development part of his administration. And he was also picked to be a running mate for Hillary Clinton. Now, the reason that you don't know who Julian Castro is because, well, let's be honest, he's not really all that exciting. He's not really all that important. And the things that he has to say aren't really all that compelling. He does take corporate money. So obviously, you know that we're not going to advocate for him here. And other than the reparations conversation, including the reparations conversation, he basically campaigns in platitudes. And you know how I feel about that. So I recently came across an interview that he did thanks to Kyle Kulinski's recent video covering him. And he tried to take shots at Bernie Sanders. Now, we're going to actually talk about that entire conversation. We're going to talk about a little bit, very little, because we've already covered it, about Bernie Sanders' response. We're going to talk a lot about Julian Castro's response. And then we're even going to address, I got a lot of respect for Kyle. I love the work he does, but I think it's always important to address and correct things that should be addressed and corrected. That's out of respect for a colleague or somebody that I consider a colleague in this progressive broadcasting industry. So first, let's check out that clip that basically shows Julian Castro trying to backhandedly trash Bernie Sanders.
Take a listen to Bernie Sanders, one of your campaign rivals, at a CNN town hall when it was pointed out that you and Elizabeth Warren support some form of reparations.
What do they mean? I'm not sure that anyone's very clear. What I've just said is that I think we must do everything that we can to address the massive level of disparity that exists in this country.
So what do you mean? Do you think that there should be actual monetary payments to descendants of slaves? Do you support more like what Senator Sanders is talking about, policies such as child care and education that help those who are disadvantaged?
What I said was that I've long believed that this country should address slavery, the original sin of slavery, including by looking at reparations. And if I'm president, then I'm going to appoint a commission or task force to determine the best way to do that. There's a tremendous amount of disagreement on how we would do that. But let me just say something about Senator Sanders' response there, because he was also asked this question in 2016. Mm-hmm. What he said on The View, I think, the other day was that he didn't think the best way to address this was for the United States to write a check. To my mind, that may or may not be the best way to address it. However, it's interesting to me that when it comes to Medicare for all, health care, the response there has been, we need to write a big check. That when it comes to tuition-free or debt-free college, the answer has been, we need to write a big check. And so if the issue is compensating the descendants of slaves, I don't think that the argument about writing a big check ought to be the argument that you make if you're making an argument that a big check needs to be written for a whole bunch of other stuff.
Interesting.
So if under the Constitution we compensate people because we take their property, why wouldn't you compensate people who actually were property?
All right. So first of all, let me just go ahead and clarify once again how I felt about what Bernie Sanders said. I think Bernie Sanders is fundamentally misinformed when it comes to what reparations is supposed to do versus what his universal programs would do. He talks often about racial inequality, so he gets that part. And then it should be no surprise to him that racial inequality will not improve under universal programs. You have to understand that. And it's not like, ending racial. So if everything, if all races, tactics and policies and were in institutions, because there are still some, like in credit and loans, if they were all eliminated today, it would still take 225 years for black families to catch up with their white families, as far as wealth is concerned. and I've already explained this already. Our communities, quote unquote, the black community is the black community not by ownership, but mostly in connection of experience. It's not because we own a bunch of stuff. Like, if you say the Jewish community, you are referring to an ownership class. When you're talking about the Cuban community, you're referring to an ownership class within that community. Even the Arab and Desi communities have ownerships in their various communities. That's most often not the case in the black community. And so assuming that just because you reinvest a couple of things doesn't, that's going to fix income inequality, it would be sadly mistaken. And like I said, just unfortunately for Bernie, it's misinformed. It's misinformation. Not like I said, I don't think he's doing it on purpose, but I do have to correct that. Y'all know if I do have one gripe with Bernie, that would be one of them. I'm not saying that I'm just speaking facts. I'm not speaking as to whether or not you should or shouldn't vote for him, but I am going to speak facts when it comes to this particular issue because I don't like misinformation in any sense of it. And I don't really care what the issue is, as you can probably tell by now. So essentially, like just as a brief example, I talk about gentrification. Gentrification is a huge problem now. Even Bernie Sanders and Kyle and Julian Castro would all admit this. Gentrification is a problem because of what? Because of a lack of capital. Why? Because if we had access to capital, then we would have been able to start our own businesses. But the only type of capital that we were able to get access to was predatory capital. In other words, capital that was already owed and owned by someone else at a higher percentage. But even then, that was like a favorable outcome. Most outcomes, because of redlining, resulted in no capital. In other words, we were not given business loans. We were not given housing loans. Therefore, we don't, for the most part, own things. Now, what happens when you don't own things is that you don't get to dictate the economy of your community. So if you don't get to dictate the economy of your community, somebody does. And Arab, Desis, white people, Chinese, Korean, whatever, whoever moves in with the most money, does get to dictate the economy of your community. So they bring their businesses in, which brings better employment and brings in more revenue to the city or to the town or whatever. Property taxes increase. The black families get priced out. This is what gentrification is. So do you think that if we had the paychecks back then, that we would be in the gentrification situation we're in right now? No, because why? We would own the businesses. Property taxes would have already increased at least to such a degree that it wouldn't be profitable for someone to come in and try to flip the economy of that town because they're already doing well enough that big corporations wouldn't really be able to do much about it, or at least wouldn't be able to profit off of kicking them out. So that's just an example. Another example, you say, okay, we'll get rid of racist credit scores and racist loan practices. That sounds good, but I still have to be able to pay things off. I still will have debt attached to my name. I'm not saying me personally, but there are people who will still have debt attached to their name because of racist loan practices, because of predatory loan practices, because of racist employment practices. So just because you fix racist credit scores doesn't mean that I can all of a sudden pay off my debt without any money that a lot of people, 60% of this country and this country's wealth is inherited. So there are people being born into a surplus while others are being born into a debt. So I just had to clarify that for everybody who's just curious about like why I stand where I stand on Bernie's comments in that particular situation. That's why, because they're fundamentally misinformed. So Julian Castro's comments weren't any better though. And I want to be very specific about that because they were not. Like, I may or may not be for pay for cash reparations. I'm about observing it, checking it out, seeing what could happen. That's interesting because for one, let me be very specific or very clear about something. Julian Castro has not once mentioned HR 40. HR 40 has been revamped. It's been signed on to by co-sponsored by 30 Congress people, including Ro Khanna and Tulsi Gabbard. Now, if you did care about reparations, if you were looking into it, if this is something that you were taking seriously, this is something that would take place during your presidency. Why have you not mentioned it? Why have you not clarified it? If reparations are indeed important to you, why are you not bringing it up? And the truth of the matter is, he isn't bringing it up because he actually isn't considering reparations. I want to be very clear about that. He is not. He's not considering reparations, and he is using reparations as a talking tool to fool people into thinking that he actually would do anything for black people, because he would not. He would not do anything for us. Sorry, I don't know what else to say. Like, it's the best way I could put it. So he's wrong there, right? He was trying to basically pander, and then he said I may or may not be for giving out checks. Then what are you talking about? Because that's literally what Bernie was asking you about. What are you talking about then? Because the reparations conversation that was started because of the ADOS movement specifically is talking about checks. HR 40, the Conyers bill, co-signed by both Ro Khanna and Tulsi Gabbard, is talking about the potentiality, if that is what is necessary, of checks because of everything that I just talked to you about. So you being may or may not for check, you may or may not be for check. I don't want to hear that. Nobody wants to hear that. It's either you are or you're not. Or you could even say, I'm willing to research, put a specific team together, and address this, with what is best. If that is checks, then yes, it's checks. If it's other methods or mean, then we'll use that. If it's both, then we'll implement both, but it needs to be addressed. It's that simple. Because I don't even know what the best way to fix to have the reparations conversation is, but I do know that the operative word in reparations is repair. Universal programs don't repair what we have lost. Like I said, when you have one class of people that were born 60% of wealth inherited, born into a surplus, whereas one group of people, because of how they look when they were born, are born into a debt. And it's really, that's about as simple as you can break it down. So you can't be mayor, you can't be possibly for it and possibly against it. It's either, I'm for the best solution, whatever that may be, period. If the best solution happens to be checks, then you need to be in support of that. If you really believe in this, I mean. Now, Kyle said some things that I agree with him with. I do believe Julian is hacked. I do believe that he is pandering. I do believe that his attacks against Bernie Sanders were illegitimate. But I do have to critique, or at least correct Kyle on some claims that he had in the video. Not because, like I said, I'm not attacking him or anything like that. It's just more so when you have that big of an audience, it is important to be correct and honest if you're going to critique Castro, because you're also setting up Bernie for failure potentially. So let's check out this clip, and then I'll go ahead and talk about it.
Going to hurt you, hurting yourself, number two, because you're staking a claim by the most unpopular policy position. So it's not a gotcha. It's like you're running to a position where most Americans are going to go, I don't agree with you on that. And then you think like, yeah, see, I'm further left. And I've made this point in regards to the death penalty too. Like, the death penalty in this country, whether we like it or not, is popular. Now, does that mean that if you're in office that you don't do anything to try to stop the death penalty? No. But it does mean you don't fucking run on it. Who does that? I'm going to run on this thing, which is not popular at all, and then maybe that'll help me get elected. If you do that, people are going to say, I don't agree with that. And even if you make fucking amazing arguments and somehow you get to move the poll numbers on that, congratulations, you moved reparations, from 32% in the polls to what? What are we thinking it could top out at? Even if you had the best arguments being made for it, 40% in one election cycle, you jump from 32 to 40, still massively unpopular. It's just dumb politics.
So, Kyle says that Julian Castro and Bernie shouldn't talk about it, shouldn't be for it, whatever, because it doesn't poll well. I think it's supported about 34% of Americans. And therefore, Bernie shouldn't talk about it, and Julian Castro is wrong for asking Bernie to talk about it. Julian Castro's attacks were disingenuous, but I would have to disagree with Kyle. What Kyle seems to forget is I shouldn't say the one thing, that would be untrue also, but one of the things that made Bernie so impressive, that made Bernie so popular, is his ability to take issues that were either unpopular or innocuous and make them popular by bringing them front and center to the American people and helping them realize how much it is necessary. Not only that, but when we're talking about race specifically, one of the things that has garnered so much support for Bernie Sanders within the minority community, amongst the marginalized, is the fact that he was willing to bring the conversation of race into mainstream politics, willing to bring the conversation of the prison industrial complex and how it specifically affects black people into mainstream politics, willing to bring the conversation about the travesties that have happened and continue to happen to our Native American brothers and sisters into mainstream politics. Now, prior to Bernie Sanders, I think Kyle would probably know, because he is an educated young man, those were all political suicides. Doing that, talking about those things in the past, specifically and especially during the presidential primary, was political suicide. You know that. It was. That's why nobody did it. How many times did Barack Obama mention his race? I'll answer that question for you. 0. 0 times. 0. It was deemed political suicide because neoliberal culture, along with neoconservatives, have conditioned us to believe that talking about race and talking about our the quote unquote sins of this nation regarding race is divisive. Reparations are not for almost anybody else that we've given or helped to make sure they get, whether it's the Jewish people, whether it's some Native American people in various states, whether it's Japanese Americans who receive reparations. The only time reparations the only time that reparations has been divisive, it's only when it comes to black people, and it's because of the race component. It's because of the racial component that's because why? We're taught that race divides. Why? Because we've been conditioned to be divided by race. That's how it's been. It's a crab in a barrel or crab in a bucket mentality. The white working class was convinced, over the centuries, but we can look as recent as Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, where they pit the white working class against black people and told them that we're the reason that all their problems persist, just like the white working class has been pitted against undocumented immigrants now, that they're the reasons that their problems exist. And it's so on and so forth. Education fixes that. Reality fixes that. Like once you have a grasp of it, it fixes that, but it takes time. But first it takes somebody to bring up the issue. So you're correct. Polling at 34%, it isn't popular. But fun fact, Medicare for All at 2014, single payer I should say, 37%. Bernie Sanders announced running on Medicare for All as one of the pillars to his agenda in 2015. Now, after, can't believe it's 2019. After 5 years now, or coming up on 5 years, 5 years later, because of Bernie Sanders, 70% approval rating, nearly, like you just stated in your video. Now, before talking about race, talking about the prison industrial complex specifically, talking about Native Americans, bringing these conversations to the forefront was once political suicide. Now, the Democratic Party is trying to use them to pander because, they saw it work for Bernie, so they're hoping it can work for them too. Because there is something about being honest that people truly appreciate. They do. There were Republicans who were voting for Bernie because of his honesty. There were Democrats, obviously, for the same thing. Now, as far as the strategy is concerned, remember, there were other reasons as well, like lack of coverage, but Bernie did get his ass handed to him on Super Tuesday. Why? South Carolina, Alabama, North Carolina, I want to say Louisiana. Basically, states that have a dominant black population in concentrated areas that would, like in metropolitan areas specifically, that would significantly affect the outcome of a Democratic primary election. Bernie got beat in. Yes, coverage was a huge part of that. But also, Don't you want to be able to ensure your victory in such a split primary? Don't you want to be able to secure, because it's not all, remember, this isn't all or nothing. Delegates are split. Do you want to take the chance that Kamala takes enough delegates here, takes enough delegates there, takes enough delegates there, takes enough delegates there, and then Tulsi, who has signed on to reparation legislation, will also take her fair. She's gonna take her share. Trust me. So now you've excluded yourself from a conversation that would have almost all but guaranteed you a victory in Super Tuesday. And now you're allowing people to come in and sweep up delegates that you absolutely need going into the convention. I'm not saying pitch this 100% during the general election. I'm not saying that. And I don't think it would be wise. I think he should say his piece on it and then move on. But once people know that because Bernie has a history, truthfully, unlike almost anyone else we ever seen, which is that when he says he advocates for something, he advocates for it. There's going to be legislation on that floor. Now, in the case of Bernie Sanders, there's already legislation on the floor in the House. It would get to the Senate, and then he would sign off on it, of course. I have no doubt in my mind that he would sign off on reparation legislation. But because of his history, he's one of the few who could advocate for something in the primary and then talk about it when it's necessary in the general, but not base his entire platform off of it. But because of his history, people would still know, look, he can't talk about that. It's a divisive issue. Or maybe it's not. Maybe by then it wouldn't be a divisive issue. Maybe by that time we're able to have real conversations about these things. Maybe not. Who knows? But if it's still a divisive issue, Bernie's the type of guy who has a way of making unpopular issues popular. Now, I will concede that Kyle is correct. This isn't an issue that benefits everybody. So maybe it won't ultimately be that popular. But having a conversation about race isn't, it's like I said, it's divisive. But Bernie made it mainstream. Trying to at least pretend to have a real conversation about race. Bernie made that mainstream in the Democratic Party. I've seen people who, just as a black man, people come up to me more now than they've ever in my past, because that awakening that they got from 2016 has made them question their own convictions. And it's like, wow, am I doing enough? Am I really being an ally? And this is a matter of moral and ethical consistency for Bernie specifically, So, but yeah, that's how I feel about the whole situation. I think Kyle did a great video on it. Just had to clarify those things. Julian Castro is a shill. Don't believe anything he says. He's not for reparations. Neither is Kamala. Neither is Elizabeth Warren. But more than anything else, always remember, find your balance. Peace. Thank you for watching that segment of Mi Casa es Su Casa. Help us reach our goal of 500 patrons. You can do so by donating as little as $1 by clicking on the Patreon link in the description below. Don't forget, join us on Roku and JustNForm. You can follow us on Twitter and Facebook as well. And remember, more than anything else, find your balance. Peace.